Evan Turner made a tweet saying essentially that he would retire from watching basketball if Gordon Hayward was slated to retire, and it was actually probably one of the most random tweets that someone would have seen in a day. But it makes sense when you see the context that's provided with the tweet. You see, Evan Turner's draft was in 2010, and if we look at all the players within the draft, every single player excluding PG has retired from the game. This is crazy when we also consider all of the big names that came from the draft. We obviously got to start by highlighting the first pick in the draft with John Wall, then there's later DeMarcus Cousins, and we also had, of course, PG in this draft. All of those are names that we would associate with at least high-level stars or maybe even superstars, at least when we looked at their peaks. But there were also a bunch of names that, while they weren't superstar level, they were very notable players during their time. Some would include Eric Bledsoe. I remember people calling him the mini LeBron. Lance Stevenson, one of the funniest but high energy players we've ever seen in the game. Larry Sanders, one of the better defenders that came out of this draft but just didn't live up to his potential. We also had Avery Bradley, one of the best defenders, if not the best defender in this draft. And when they passed the ball to this man in the corners, it was an automatic three. Hell, even a player like Grievous Vasquez was in this draft. And I remember when I'd look at the ESPN stat scores for the team he was on, sure, they'd lose, but he'd have somewhere around 15 to 25 points, 8 assists, and somewhere around 6 rebounds. He was dang near a triple-double before that became more common today. So it's safe to say that while this draft class might have not been the best of its time, it was one of the more memorable ones, and I had fun watching many of the players here. So I thought to make a mini-series about some of the best players within this draft, and I thought it would make sense to start off with the guy mentioned in the tweet, Gordon Hayward. While in recent memory we'll mostly think about his time with the Celtics and the Hornets and then his very brief OKC stint where he had no play, he was one of the more underrated players during the early and mid 2010s when he was on the Jazz. When he was first drafted, Deron Williams was still on his team and he was still good. That's how long ago that was. 14 years. And Gordon Hayward definitely was no slouch. If you were watching him, he was athletic, otherwise he was sneaky athletic. You can look at these clips for examples. But unfortunately for him, he was caught in ever-changing lineups. There was no consistency until his later years with the Jazz. So he was basically slated to be on a mediocre lineup, which would result in a mediocre team. Despite this, he was an important part of keeping the Jazz relevant. After sticking with the core of Deron Williams, Al Jefferson, and Paul Millsap, he held the team together once they all left. And this happened for more than half the decade until 2016-17, where the Jazz were a 50-win team despite being a 5th seed. Gordon Hayward was in his prime. They had George Hill, who recently left the Indiana Pacers and was in his prime. They had Rudy Gobert, who at this point was a 2-time All-Defensive Player and won his first Defensive Player of the Year. And they had veterans in Joe Johnson and Boris Diaw. They also had Ingles, but he's not a veteran. He's like a young rookie. I don't know how to really put that. But yeah, they had Joe Ingles. After Hayward led his team to a 51-31 record, he would have to lead his team against the Los Angeles Clippers, who ended up with the same record, but they were slotted a seed above them. This matchup inevitably led to one of the best matchups in the first round. And while you wouldn't think that a dull and boring Jazz team would be exciting to go up against the Lob City Clippers, it makes sense when you put it into context. The Utah Jazz, after 6 years of mediocrity, climbed up to a point where they were comparable to some of the better teams in the league. And the Clippers are going to need a lot more context, so let's start with the season before. While the Clippers were still good, they were a far cry from their previous iterations of the teams where they had 2 second-round exits. They lost to Lillard and the McCollum-led Trailblazers in 6 games in the first round. And for the upcoming season at the time, they started off the season 10-2, which was great. But of course, they faced a typical injury bug that they've experienced for their past iterations of their team, and Blake Griffin got injured. As if things couldn't get worse, a month later CP3 got injured, and despite Blake Griffin returning, the Clippers were viewed as an inevitable 5th, 6th, or 7th seed. Here's the quote highlighting this. It specifically notes that despite Blake Griffin returning, the Clippers looked about the same right after Chris Paul's injury, so Blake Griffin had little to no impact. And LA is currently not a top 5 team at the moment. The article also adds more pressure on the Clippers, noting that this was probably the last run that this core would have. So when the Clippers ended up as a 4th seed against the 5th seeded Jazz, this was essentially a declining team clinging on to their last grasp of hope against a slowly rising Utah Jazz team. Now let's look at Game 1 of the series. This was a close game from the start to a finish with an unbelievable ending. As you would expect, the Clippers started off with the lead, but the game was never far from the Jazz. Blake Griffin was dominant the entire game, sure, and Chris Paul was as surgical as you would expect him to be in his prime. But despite that, the Jazz were able to keep up with the team. There were incredible plays from both sides. I mean, just look at this shot from CP3. This is just crazy. Now let's look at this last second heave that George Hill threw up. This was just an enjoyable game to watch for the video. I mean, you guys gotta watch this. But now let's go to the end of the game.
Paul gets it back. They've got Ingles on him. Paul driving, puts it up. It's good off glass. Ties the game at 95.
CP3 hits an incredible floater with 13 seconds left to tie the game. And remember when I mentioned that Joe Johnson was on the team? Yeah, this is ISO Joe. So on the last possession of the game, we obviously know who the Jazz are going to go to. Joe Johnson for an isolation play. And let's just see how it turns out.
5, Utah has a timeout. Gets it across half court. Won't use the timeout. 5 seconds left. Joe Johnson with 4. Johnson with 2. Drives in. Puts it up. Gets the bounce at the gun. And the Jazz win game 1.
ISO Joe stunned the crowd and led his team to a win with a team high of 21 points. But the Clippers would inevitably come back with Game 2 to tie the series 1-1. This would lead us into Game 3. Not only the turning point of the series, but probably the best game that you would see from the series as well. It was basically the battle of the best for both teams. So Chris Paul versus Gordon Hayward. Right off the start of the game, it looked like Gordon Hayward couldn't miss. Of course, he was able to score well off the constructed plays of Quinn Snyder, but it was more than just that. Every single shot that Gordon Hayward took was just money. He was beating any defender out of the post when needed. It felt like he was hitting every single shot behind the arc, and he was fighting against the Clippers' physicality every single time. The Clippers couldn't stop him. On the other side, CP3 wouldn't let the game slip from the Clippers. It seemed that every single time Hayward made a play, CP3 would respond right back with a play of his own. This was sorely needed from the Clippers as the Jazz were starting to take over, and Blake Griffin would also eventually suffer a toe injury and would not be able to return for the rest of the game. With Blake Griffin out of the picture, this would only serve to fuel Chris Paul even more to keep the Clippers' hope alive. As the game kept going along, he began to sharpen up his decision making.
That's his first three-pointer made. The lead jumps back to 7.
It eventually got to the point for the Jazz that it was impossible to stop him, just like the Clippers couldn't stop Gordon Hayward. After the Clippers gained momentum, Gordon Hayward continued the offensive pressure on the other side. Whenever a tough basket was needed, he always made sure to step up, and this was also surely needed again, because as the game was drawing closer to the end, there was barely any separation made for either team. Hayward was taking advantage of whatever he could in order to edge out a win for his team, but unfortunately once CP3 gets hot, there's little you can do to stop him. Chris Paul did everything in his power to win the game, and while the Jazz had an opportunity to get this game, the costly turnover by Gordon Hayward ultimately decided the outcome of the game. CP3 edged out the win against Gordon Hayward and won the battle of Game 3. But the war was far from over. Remember that toe injury that Blake Griffin suffered? In Clippers fashion, he suffered an injury that would ultimately keep him injured for the entire series. Now we go into Game 4 where the Clippers are heavily wounded. But fortunately for them, Gordon Hayward suffers food poisoning and would only be able to play 9 minutes of this game. But that was the good news. The bad news is that Joe Johnson decided to turn back the clock for the Jazz and put up 28 points, 5 assists, and 5 rebounds in a win. And from there, the rest of the series for the Jazz was Gordon Hayward taking over. In Game 5, Hayward put up 27 points, 8 rebounds, and 4 assists in a win. In Game 6, the Clippers edged out the Jazz, but not before getting past 31 points, 8 rebounds, and 4 assists from Hayward again. And while the Clippers tried to fight back against the Jazz in Game 7, the Jazz ran away with the game at the end, and they were once again led by the one and only Gordon Hayward, who had 26 points, 8 rebounds, and 3 assists. That is incredible consistency if I've ever seen it. The Jazz crushed the shreds of hope that the Clippers were clinging onto and went to the second round. Unfortunately for Hayward and the Jazz, his dream run ended there, as his next opponents up for him were the Golden State Warriors. The same Warriors who just lost the 2016 finals and picked up Kevin Durant. The Jazz got swept in 4, but if they had the chance to go up against any other team in the Western Conference, I'm pretty sure they would have had a competitive series. The Jazz fans cheered on Gordon Hayward and this current iterations of the Jazz team and hoped that he would return next year to continue the success that they previously experienced. But unfortunately for them, Gordon Hayward's time in Utah came to an end. From there, the story of Gordon Hayward starts to get more familiar. He would join the Boston Celtics, and in his first game with the team, he suffered an injury that took him out for the entire year. And despite being able to return afterwards, he was just never the same player afterwards. Gordon Hayward was a budding star with a bunch of potential, and at his peak, he was able to lead his team to beat a former contender. Maybe he could have been more in Boston, but injuries truly got in the way of a potential Hall of Fame career. And when we take another look at the draft, it becomes a more common theme. And with the end of the story of Gordon Hayward, the next chapter of the series focuses on the star DeMarcus Cousins.